There was also an air of expectancy about the Killarney event, with enormous interest in the debut of the state-of-the-art Opel Calibra, to be driven by South African champion Mike Briggs. The impressive Calibra was built in the Cape Town workshop of race car boffin Owen Ashley.
The project took about 2.5 months to design. I would like to have had longer time, but because of the money that's been put in, the company obviously want to return pretty quickly, so you can't spend a year designing it and then start to build it. So it took 2 months to design and then 4 months to construct. It was going in 6 months. But of course now we're right in the middle of all the testing phase. We've had a fair amount of problem with the engine, which now seems to have come right. So we've only really had 2.5 days of proper testing, setting up suspension, and already the car is showing a lot of potential. We're within a second of the fastest cars, and we believe that this afternoon it's even going to go quicker. Engine had to be changed in that it's usually used in rear-engine sports cars, and it has a much higher intake manifold. And to keep the lines of the Calibra looking as close to original as possible, we sent them a drawing of how we wanted the inlet manifold changed. That in turn has managed to keep the lines of the car looking original, but in the same time it's caused quite a lot of problems in that we've had backfiring up it because it is a little bit too short. But we've now managed to overcome that by changing the fuel injection timing, and together with the Americans we've overcome quite a few problems. Since we've now been allowed to go to a bigger restrictor, nearly all of the popping and banging that we thought was caused by the inlet manifold has stopped, and the engine is running far, far better than what it was. In fact, we wasted nearly 2 months on getting the engine to run properly. So I would say that we're probably 2 months behind with the development of the rest of the car because of that. But that's just one of the learning curves that you've got to go through.
The Calibra ran into immediate controversy with a decision by the authorities to increase the size of the turbo restrictor, a bone of contention. Wesbank Association chairman and AA Motorsport controller Dick Sorensen explained the rationale behind the decision.
Prior to the start of the season, we were looking forward to a number of new motor cars coming into the category, particularly in Class A. And we specified 52mm restrictors for all turbocharged cars. It was a bit of a guess. We also said that during the first couple of meetings, there'd probably be some dramatic changes. Now what's happened is, first of all, most of the new cars didn't arrive except for the Calibra. And secondly, the Calibra come along with a dyno-tuned engine from the US. When we tried to run it here in South Africa, it's given a lot of trouble, and they've been searching around. They flew a guy out to look at the engine management system, so on and so forth. And the car really is only run in the centre of the field or the centre of Class B. So we had a problem. It's not good for our category of racing, the premier category in South Africa. And on request, what we decided to do was to give them the freedom to test a 56mm restrictor. I would be here, I would monitor the tests, and if necessary, go back to 52 if that was what made the car competitive. So they weren't going to run away. Now obviously, the other teams don't quite understand the philosophy behind it. They see that they're being given freedom that they weren't given when they were doing their development, and they've complained a lot.
I think the whole decision was not well thought out by the controllers. It was very premature. I mean, the team is in its infancy. They have numerous other problems that they're trying to sort out, like any new race car team. And given time, I'm sure they'll sort them out. I don't believe it was the right thing to do, to create a precedent by saying that the team had told them that they couldn't get the car to run properly, so one of the obvious things to do is to allow the engine to produce more horsepower. Well, that all helps, but it doesn't really put the controllers, I don't think, in a good light. It doesn't look as though they've really given it enough thought before doing something like this.
The agreement has always been with changes, major changes to these cars, that if you run for 2 races and you're not competitive, you will get some relief. And that's how it's always been. This car hasn't even run yet. I mean, where's it run? I mean, Kyle Army was a Mickey Mouse Club race, not of really much interest to anybody. You must run the thing first. Don't cry before you hurt.
Mazda has been asking for some relief since the beginning of the year, and that has been denied us. And I feel that although the motor racing needs to be competitive, the issue about the restrictors should have been discussed with the rest of the manufacturers, and their blessing should have been gotten for it, because the rules don't cater for it. And I think that it would have been a lot less painful for everybody if it had been discussed with everybody beforehand.
But I think good sense and good sportsmanship will prevail, and the Calibra will run there, in amongst the Class A cars, maybe behind if all the Class A cars go as good as they normally do. But let's see.
Going into the Cape Town race, veteran Sarel van der Merwe and the Sasol Ford Sapphire and young Chris Aberdeen in the Bosel Audi 500 were locked together at the top of the championship. In the Manufacturers' Championship, the Volkswagen SA entered Audis of Aberdeen, and defending Wesbank champion Terry Moss had established an early lead. There was also a great deal of interest at Killarney in the return to the track of local hero Serge Damso. The former South African rally champion was back in a superbly turned out four-wheel drive Toyota Sprinter.
I'm happy to be back in the Wesbank. At least I'm involved with the motor racing again. And I felt a bit out, staying out, you know, for a while, a few months now, out of Group N and that. So at least I'm doing something now. Well, you know, it's not a Class A car, what I would have liked to be, but it's better than nothing.
Tell us about your new car.
Well, the car arrived the last minute on Thursday evening, and so we haven't had much time to test the car, but I'm very happy the way the car's going. And I must say the guys in Durban did a very nice job, and the car's performing well.
The Wesbank Championship, taking a leaf out of the rules for the German touring car series, has new tyre regulations in force this season. The new tyre regulations affect cars in all the various classes. Once again, Wesbank race controller Dick Sorensen explains the thinking behind the move.
There's factory teams creeping into even some of the lower classes now, which brings a lot more money to those classes and makes some of those factory cars far more competitive than the amateur cars. So we decided what we would like to do was to limit the expenditure to some degree. So we've introduced tyre rules. First of all, for Class A. In Class A, the tyres you qualify on, you must do the first race on. You can use whatever you like for the second race. In Class B, C and D, you're limited to 6 tyres per race meeting. So any 6 marked tyres, and we mark the tyres prior to qualifying, you've got to run those tyres in qualifying, the first race and the second race.
The sort of hype that characterizes qualifying sessions in Formula One racing is now part and parcel of motorsport meetings worldwide. The race cam catches Chris Aberdeen hard at work in the Bosel Audi during qualifying. The Killarney qualifying was dominated by Aberdeen and teammate Terry Moss, who took the first 2 places on the grid. Strategy in qualifying plays as important a role as it does during the race.
Last year we used qualifying tyres. This year we have to qualify on race tyres, so it's possibly a lot easier because you don't have to set the car up twice on 2 different compounds. And then we go out in the session and we try and do as little qualifying as possible so that the tyres are good for the first heat. And I was lucky, my first lap was a clear lap, and it was pole, and I was very happy with that.
For Randfontein panel beater Ben Morgenroot, trips to coastal race venues are welcome interludes. At sea level, Morgenroot's normally aspirated Mazda 323 is able to compete on a more equal basis with a turbocharged opposition.
When we come down from the high altitude of the Transvaal down to the coast, we gain approximately 17% in horsepower. That's the normally aspirated engine. The turbocharged engines gain as well, but not as much. I would guess that they probably don't gain more than 8 or 9% coming down here. The result being that my car performs better at the coast against the turbo cars than it normally does up at the high altitude.
The ups and downs of motor racing were mirrored by BMW stalwart Tony Viana. Niggly mechanical problems meant that Viana was not having a happy time of it during the qualifying sessions.
I was battling a bit with brakes, and I didn't want to try and destroy my car. Normally we are a day before, this time we decided, no, we won't come and wear our car up. And I think I did the wrong choice. We'll see in the race. I think for the race, hopefully things will be better again. So it's going to be one of those races that is going to be, I think, good to watch.
Like all sportsmen, race drivers have likes and dislikes when it comes to venues. Gearmax Nissan star Johan Coetzee, a former Wesbank champion, has a soft spot for Killarney.
I've always liked Killarney, especially with the escort in the escort days. But even with the Nissan, it's a nice circuit. You know, the atmosphere is good. The spectators are tremendous. I mean, it's one of the best circuits for spectators, and they all support you. And there's a lot of Nissan supporters here, and Johan Coetzee supporters, which I appreciate.
For South African drivers champion Mike Briggs, the controversy surrounding the Opel Calibra was an irritant. The Port Elizabeth Steakhouse owner was determined not to let the issue interfere with his mental approach to a tough weekend.
Mental preparation is something that's very important, certainly in this level of racing. And I personally, I like to just take half an hour or so before the race and sit down and plan my whole race, think of every possibility. I'll find a quiet corner and go and just sit down quietly and work it all out, because, you know, there's so many things that can happen during the course of a race that I think if you've been through it before, if you've been through it in your mind, you're just so much better prepared. And this has actually now become somewhat of a trademark of mine, and I think it's ultimately it is paying off. I've been, well, Cyril van der Merwe has said that I'm probably one of the most thinking drivers that he's seen, and that's a compliment. I like to know that what I'm doing out there is pre-planned and somewhat calculated. You can't do everything on the spur of the moment, certainly not in these cars. They're just too fast to wait for something to happen before you try and fix it. You have to be just that one step ahead of the car. And that's what I like to do. And I noticed that Killarney at the Grand Prix, I was fortunate enough to go into the McLaren pit, and pretty much the similar situation with Ayrton Senna. He doesn't speak to anybody half an hour before a race or a qualifying session, and he's probably the master of the art of mental preparation and mental psych, because what he also does is he psychs out his opposition. So it works for me and it works for him, so it can't be that bad.
Reigning Wesbank champion Terry Moss took the title in his rookie year in the series. Moss, a father of three, has the reputation for being a tough character on the racetrack, and the race cam in the factory-entered Audi gives an insight into his aggressive style of driving. Moss also has a reputation as a water diviner in his native Eastern Cape, and lists among his hobbies farming and solar power. Apart from his success on the racetrack, Terry admits to be eyeing the possibility of a rally career.
I'd like to get into rallying. The time hasn't been right yet. Our motorsport division has been very busy with development, and maybe in the near future, with a bit of pressure from myself, maybe I could get a drive in a rally car. Maybe a Class C or Class B car, but at this stage one has to start somewhere.
Now, a lot closer to 50 than he is to 40, Cyril van der Merwe is a legend in his own time in South African motorsport. With so many young lions after his blood these days, we wondered if retirement is an issue that occasionally crosses his mind.
I don't think it's going to be that long before I give up. You know, the problem is I'm still competitive, and you wouldn't like to get out of it too early, because I don't believe in anything such as a comeback. So I'd rather stay a bit longer, and when I stop, I'll stop permanently.
You've shown a lot of interest in Michael Briggs. Would you care to expand on that?
Well, I think he's going to be our top driver very soon. He's got a lot of natural talent. He's got a lot of inherent ability, and his whole attitude is very good. I think he's going to go a long way. Apart from that, he's also a friend of mine.
With all the preliminaries out of the way, it was finally down to the real business of racing in the first of two heats with precious championship points at stake. The Audis of Chris Aberdeen and Terry Moss took the first two positions on the grid, with Briggs and the Opel Calibra starting at the back of the Class A field after gearbox problems during qualifying. This was the scene from the race cam in Van der Merwe's Sasol Ford Sapphire, as Aberdeen and Moss led the cars away on their warm-up lap. We also had a camera mounted on the rear wing of the Audi driven by Terry Moss. With the Wesbank cars fitted with huge racing slicks, the drivers weave around on the warm-up lap in an effort to build up tyre temperatures. This is crucial for optimum performance from the tyres, and with the Class A cars pushing out between 450 and 550 horsepower, drivers need all the grip on the track they can get. Drivers also use the warm-up lap to study track conditions and potential danger points. With a full field of cars ranging from the Class A monsters to the smaller capacity Class D competitors, they made for an impressive sight, with Table Mountain as imperious as ever in the background. It takes mega budgets to race this sort of machinery with a car's highly sophisticated thoroughbreds. For manufacturers and drivers, prestige is as much at stake as championship points. The old adage that what wins on the racetrack on Saturday sells in the showroom on Monday is a truism. The Sasol Ford Sapphire is powered by a 2-litre turbocharged motor. Top speed from the 420 kilowatts and rear-wheel drive is 300 kilometers an hour. The tree-lined Malmesbury Straight is the fastest section of the Killarney circuit, with the Class A cars hitting speeds of around 250 kilometers an hour. As with Formula One racing, drivers are subjected to rapid changes in gravitation forces, and with ultra-stiff suspensions to improve road holding, the men behind the wheel take a hammering. At the end of the warm-up lap, the adrenaline really starts to pump as the cars close in to take up station on poleman Chris Aberdeen. As the driver in pole position, Aberdeen is the one to dictate the pace as the drivers approach the start line and wait for lights to turn green. As the lights turned to green, Briggs made a demon start and blasted the Opel Calibra past Ben Morgenrood's Mazda. The two cars almost touched, and there was an early moment for Sarel van der Merwe and the Sasol Ford Sapphire, with the two Audis leading a high-speed train on their first lap of the 3.2-kilometer circuit. As the cars went through the kink leading to Volkswagen corner, the two Audis were in front of Briggs and the Calibra. Van der Merwe was fourth, but under threat from Morgenrood, who flew through on the inside as the cars dived into Sabat corner. The race cam action is from the Van der Merwe Sasol Ford Sapphire. As the cars approached the tricky Stanley curve at the end of the main straight for the first time, the Audis still had the Calibra in their mirrors. Stanley arrives at a rapid rate of knots and calls for some serious braking. Sweeping past the pits for the first time, Moss missed a gear and provided Briggs with an opportunity to storm through into second place. Races are won and lost on mistakes like that, but Briggs quickly proved he is also human by spinning out at Continental corner. The race cam on the Moss Audi catches the tail end of the Briggs excursion. Now how about a full frontal from Van der Merwe's race cam?
Just ran out of gears there. The car is a box full of neutrals, about as many neutrals as it's got forward speeds.
Aberdeen was soon in a commanding position in the Bosel Audi and was a man hard at work. A good battle was developing between Class B leader Dion Jabert in the BMW, Gary Dunkley in the Porsche, and Tony Viana in the second factory Beamer. Viana had Dunkley in his sights and was ready to pounce. Further down the field, there was plenty of close racing, with Briggs, after his spin, back in action again and starting to make up lost ground in the Calibra. A determined Ben Morgenrood in the Mazda was staying in touch with the leading Audis. With extra power at sea level for the normally aspirated rotary engine, Morgenrood was creeping up on Moss. The battle with Viana was keeping Gary Dunkley occupied in the Porsche. Viana was all over the back of the Porsche, with the rest of the Class B field in tow. Ben Morgenrood is a fan of the comedian Jerry Lewis, but there wasn't anything funny about the way he was starting to move in on Moss in the second-placed Audi. Morgenrood had the bit between his teeth and was climbing all over the back of Moss, who occasionally looked a little ragged as the pressure mounted. fight with Tony Viana was also starting to reach crisis proportions for Gary Dunkley, with Johan Coetzee and the Gearmax Nissan Skyline also in the picture. Another class leader under threat was Dave Repsold in the Automark Toyota, who had Serge Damso breathing down his neck in the Toyota Sprinter in Class C. Morgenrud was still trying to find a way past Moss, and personal battles that started to develop all around the racetrack. Briggs was also working his way back into the top 5 after his earlier indiscretion. The race camera mounted on the back of Moss's Audi told its own story of the Morgenrud challenge. Aberdeen still had matters under control in the Bosel Audi, and it was up to teammate Moss to look after himself. For some of the back markers, the Moss-Morgenrud confrontation produced problems of another kind, with getting out of the firing line the priority. The race cam also provided a bird's eye view of the classic overtaking maneuver, with Morgenrud pulling out of Moss's slipstream to slingshot past the Audi. A superb drive was brought to a premature halt when clerk of the course, Brian Hoskins, put out the red flag to stop the race. It was a bitter blow for Morgenrud, but oil over a section of the circuit from a blown engine made conditions too dangerous to continue racing. With red flags out all over the circuit, the pace was much more sedate as drivers headed slowly back to the start-finish line. There was a buzz of excitement from the crowd as track marshals mopped up the oil with cement dust in an effort to get the circuit back into operation. On the start grid, there were mixed emotions, with one casualty in the form of the Sasol Ford Sapphire, which was wheeled away from the line after finally succumbing to lack of oil pressure. With the cars lined up again on the start grid, Mike Briggs was a study in concentration. Matters were a little more hectic in the control tower, with the timekeepers preparing for the restart. For the huge crowd packed into Killarney, a resumption of hostilities promised to provide plenty of action. A continuation of the Morgenrud-Moss battle would do for a start, and with drivers able to relax for a few minutes and get back into the fray refreshed, even the loss of the Van der Merwe Ford Sapphire wasn't enough to dampen enthusiasm. Aberdeen once again controlled the pace at the restart, with Moss showing early signs of scheming to find a way past Morgenrud as quickly as possible. As the lights turned to green, the car sent up a curtain of cement dust. The curtain of dust probably put paid to the Morgenrud-Moss confrontation before it had started. The two cars appeared to touch going into Continental Corner, and Morgenrud spun off into the wall on the inside of the circuit. Race leader Chris Aberdeen started out in kart racing and progressed through Stanley Group M into single-seaters and Wesbank modified saloons. The steering-mounted race cam provides a different view of race car driving. As was the case in the first start, Chris Aberdeen went straight to the front in the Bosel Audi. This time he was followed by Mike Briggs in the Opel Calibra, with Moss in the second Audi, followed by the BMWs of Dion Jabeur and Tony Viana. Puffs of cement dust from all over the circuit were testimony to the amounts of oil dropped on the track. With four-wheel drive to rely on, Aberdeen was unperturbed and was intent on putting as much distance as quickly as possible between him and the rest of the pack. Briggs and Moss were still in touch with the leader in second and third places, but needed to get a lot closer if they were to apply any kind of pressure on Aberdeen. Flat out on the pit straight, Aberdeen set up an effective screen of cement dust. He had a clear track ahead, but it did not take long for drivers in the lower classes to once again start getting to grips with one another. A great scrap had developed in Class C between the Nissan Sentra of George Bezuidenhout and Serge Damso in the Toyota Sprinter. Damso is equally at home in rally or race cars and knows Killarney like the back of his hand. The Toyota Sprinter sports front-wheel drive, pushes out 120 kilowatts and is capable of speeds in excess of 250 kilometers an hour. It did not take Terry Moss long to get past Mike Briggs in an ailing Opel Calibra, which showed plenty of potential first time out. While Moss went in pursuit of leader Aberdeen, the great scrap continued in Class C between the Nissan Sentra of George Besaidnote and Serge Damso in the Toyota Sprinter. After more than 40 years in motor racing, Paddy Driver is still highly competitive in the IGI Mazda RX-7. Drivers not quite of Paddy's vintage were still sorting out a few personal differences, with BMW teammates Dion Joubert and Tony Viana vying for honours in Class B. The Class C duel between Damso and Besaidnote was hotting up, but while no one had a real hope of catching the leading Audis. Young Richard Sorensen found himself in a similar position at the front of Class D in the Volkswagen City Golf. Sorensen says he has a bad temper and a fear of growing old, but he also has ambitions to race professionally overseas. The race cam footage of Terry Moss provides an interesting insight into the different driving styles adopted by the top stars. Aberdeen was controlling the race from the front, and his only fear must have been mechanical gremlins. Serge Damso had finally gone ahead of George Besaidnote in Class C and was starting to make a nuisance of himself among the Class B competitors. It was an impressive debut from the Toyota Sprinter and one which kept the hometown fans happy. It was much the same story in Joubert's case, and Viana could never mount a meaningful challenge on his young BMW stablemate. Damso kept sticking the Toyota's nose into Class B territory, and it was only a lack of power from a smaller capacity engine that kept him behind the more powerful cars. Damso, who lives in Somerset West, and Besaidnote in the Nissan had pulled well clear of the rest of the Class C runners. In the closing stages, Tony Viana was making a determined effort to get closer to Dion Joubert, and Damso was still snapping away at the heels of Class B competitors. Terry Moss was also trying to mount a late charge on Chris Aberdeen, but the Mosel Audi driver appeared to hold all the aces, and time was running out for Moss. Backmarkers were better behaved than some current Formula One drivers in letting through the quicker cars, and the impression was always there that Aberdeen was doing just enough to keep Moss where he wanted him. Damso was still up to his tricks in harrying Class B traffic, and now he must have been wishing for another 5 or 10 horsepower under the bonnet. With about 500 horsepower at their disposal, Aberdeen and Moss were able to simply walk away from the slower cars. At full throttle down the main straight and in front of the pits, the Audis were an impressive sight. Tony Viana was still doing all he could to catch Dion Joubert in Class B. As with Aberdeen and Moss, the impression was there that Joubert, an admirer of former world champion Niki Lauda and comic character Asterix, was keeping something in reserve and wasn't going to let Viana get too close. Gary Smith, in the distinctive red and yellow Mazda RX-7, must have been sick and tired of seeing nothing but Serge Damso's Toyota in his mirrors. The superbly turned out Toyota never missed a beat and must be a favourite for class honours this season. While Chris Aberdeen went his merry way in the Bosal Audi, still with Terry Moss in pursuit in the second car from the German factory, there were still a few flurries going on further down the field. With track kilometres important to cars still under development, Mike Briggs and the beautiful Opel Calibra were still circulating in third place, but it must have felt like a Sunday drive through the park. Dion Joubert and Tony Viana were still within close proximity of each other, but in its dying stages, the race had now settled into a pattern. Aberdeen and Moss were well clear, with the Audis sounding as healthy as ever as they took the checkered flag. The Opel Calibra did not sound at all healthy and was still puffing black smoke through the nose-mounted exhaust, but Opel Motorsport must have been well satisfied. In Class B, Joubert led BMW teammate Viana across the line, with Damso a comfortable winner in Class C. An untroubled drive saw Richard Sorensen take Class D in the Volkswagen City Golf, but it was a race that belonged entirely to Chris Aberdeen and the Bosal Audi. Easy win for Springbok Chris Aberdeen, with Terry Moss making it a 1-2 for Audi. Briggs brought the Calibra home third, with Aberdeen and Joubert setting new lap records.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a bit of the first start, obviously we had oil. The second start, controversial incident on the start line. But it was fun, I enjoyed it. It was a nice race. I enjoy winning like that.
I was feeling a bit tired, and I was a bit upset that the race was stopped after the first one. I was quite far ahead of Tony, and the second race was a bit tougher because by then Tony had got past everybody. So yeah, it was quite a tough race, yeah.
I really enjoyed it. It was a good race. It was the first class win we've had now. So it's a pity that David Repsol had problems, but I'm sure he'll be there for the second heat, and looking forward for a good race with him.
It was pretty easy. In the first start, okay, the first sort of half of the race, what happened was that Mike Langford was going much better than he has been, and he was chasing me very hard. Anyway, somebody went off, so they stopped the race. And in the second heat, I managed to get ahead of a couple of the higher class cars and put them between me and the guys behind me, so I was able to get away.
There was